Good morning, everyone. Miss Carol here. Thanks for joining me again. Hope you're all doing well. Well, we're going to continue with our story of David. It just doesn't seem like things are going his way right now, does it? Do you remember that last week we talked about how Jonathan, who was Saul's son, a prince, how he had become best friends with David. He even gave him his robe. He gave him his belt, his bow and arrow, his sword, just to say, this is just so you know, we are always and forever to be best friends. And so it seemed a strange pair, didn't it? But they were best friends forever. And so David had come to live in the palace permanently, hadn't he? And he was still playing his harp whenever King Saul's evil spirit would come upon him. But one day, do you remember what had happened? Saul threw his spear at David, didn't he? And David managed to escape. And this happened several times, didn't it? And he and Jonathan made up a plan, right? Where Jonathan would find out from his father if he really was trying to kill David. And then David would need to run away if it was true. And it was true, wasn't it? So Jonathan and David had to tell each other goodbye. And they didn't know when they did that if they were ever going to see each other again. And I think the day was even sadder for David because he was now going to be like a fugitive. Do you know what a fugitive is? It's someone who is always having to run away from the law, run away from something. And he was having to run away from the king, wasn't he? And that was not how he thought his life was going to be, was it? He was supposed to be the next king. And instead, he's running away from the current king, isn't he? That's right. Sad situation for David. And he was very sad. So he runs away and finds a place where he can hide. He escaped to a cave in the desert. But his brothers and his father's household joined him there. And that's a good thing to know, isn't it? Because his brothers used to be, 3 of his brothers were in Saul's army, weren't they? And a lot of other men from Saul's army left Saul's army because they didn't like what he was doing. They knew what he was doing to David was wrong. David had become a warrior, and he was fighting many battles, and they knew what King Saul was doing was wrong by chasing him. And about this time around, 400 men had joined David, and he had become their leader. And later, some men from the tribe of Gad and even Benjamin left Saul's army as well and joined forces with David and his men. And some of those men that left Saul's army were brave, very brave warriors, commanders of his army, ready for battle, able to use a shield and a spear. And the Bible tells us that these mighty men, their faces were like the faces of lions. Wow, that's pretty fierce, isn't it? And they were as fast as gazelles in the mountains. Have you ever seen a picture of a gazelle? Very, very fast. Looks a little bit like a deer, but with horns, and it would just can go over the mountains and just, it's amazing. So these men were able to do things that looked like gazelles out there as they were running. Then David talked to his parents, and he took his parents to the country of Moab. If you remember that Moab is across the Jordan River, and so he took them over to Moab because he felt like, right here is Moab, he felt like if they could be in Moab away from King Saul, then maybe they would be safe. And the king of Moab agreed that David's family could stay there with him until David learned what God's plans were for him, because at this point, he doesn't even know what he's supposed to be doing. He's just busy running away, trying not to get killed by Saul. So his family stays there. At least his mother and father do. They stay there where he feels like that they can be safe from King Saul. But God told David, you go back. You go back into Judah. You go back where King Saul is, and you go back there. That's where I want you to be. So he and his men go back there. And Saul continued to chase David in the desert strongholds, but God never did allow Saul to catch up and capture David. And we're going to begin reading a few verses in 1 Samuel chapter 23, beginning with verse 15. And it says, while David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh. Now, you know, I'm sure he never expected to see Jonathan again. Jonathan probably never expected to see David. But Jonathan managed to get away from his father long enough to go and find David. And he helped David, the Bible says, helped him find strength in God. Don't be afraid, Jonathan said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this is what's going to happen. And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. So now we know for sure that Jonathan realizes David is the chosen one of God. He is the one that is meant to be king. He will never be king. Jonathan will never be king, even when his father dies. He knows that now. And he says, and my father, King Saul, he knows that too. Unfortunately, that sort of makes Saul even more determined than ever to kill David now, doesn't it? But we know from the Bible, from some of the songs in Psalms that we read that David wrote during this time, that David was very discouraged. And he just didn't know, he didn't understand why he was having to do this. Why does he have to keep running away and fighting for his life? If he's meant to be king, why are they constantly chasing him, trying to kill him? But Jonathan, his good friend, comes and says, don't worry, have faith in God. It's all going to work out. It's all going to work out. So the Bible tells us that Saul was still trying to chase David. And in verse 26 it says, Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were going on the other side of the mountain, hurrying to get away from Saul. Can you imagine? Here's the mountain. Saul's on this side chasing, and David's on this side trying not to be seen. They were hurrying to get away from Saul, and as Saul and his forces were closing in on David, they had almost caught up with him. A messenger came to Saul saying, come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land. So Saul broke off his pursuit and he stopped chasing David, and he went to meet the Philistines. So God he spared David's life right then, didn't he? Because Saul was just about ready to catch up with him. And then David left and went up from there and lived in the strongholds of the desert of En-Gedi. And then, after Saul chased out away and fought the Philistines, he was told, okay, David's now in the desert of En-Gedi. And so Saul took 3,000 able young men and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. And he came to the sheep pens along the way. So now they're back to chasing David again. And when he came to the cave came to a cave in the mountains. And this is what the Bible says. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Relieve himself means he went to use the restroom in the cave, basically. Okay? But what he didn't know was David and his men were in that cave, but they were far back in the back of the cave. And the men said, David, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. So then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And he went back and hid again. And afterward, David felt very guilty for having cut off a corner of the king's robe. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to the Lord's anointed king. I should not lay my hand on him, for he is anointed by the Lord. And with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. And then David went out of the cave, and he called out to Saul, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed down all the way to the ground, with his face to the ground. And he said to Saul, why do you listen when men say David is going to harm you? This day you've seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in that cave. My men begged me to kill you, but I spared your life. I said, I will not lay a hand on the king, the Lord's anointed. See, look at this piece of the robe in your hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. There is nothing in my hand to say that I am guilty of anything wrong. I have not rebelled against you. I have not wronged you. But you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, is that your voice, David, my son? And he cried out loud. You are more righteous than I am, he said. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know now that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be taken from me and given to you. But please swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off any of my children or wipe out my name from my father's family. So David promised Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up into the stronghold. All right, so now Saul's acting very sorry, isn't he? Very sorry for what he's done. But is he really? That's the question. And we find out that David continues to hide. And we find out in chapter 25, verse 1, that Samuel has now died. He was a very old man. And all of Israel came together and mourned for him. And they buried him at his home in Ramah. And then David moved down to the desert of Paran. And now we learn about a certain man who was in the desert of Paran. And his name was Nabal. And he had property there in Carmel. He was very, very rich. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was mean and surly, and he was not a nice man at all, ill-tempered. And when David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep. And so they went and took care of Nabal's men. They watched over them so the Philistines didn't come and try to take the sheep away. They had been protecting Nabal's sheep and his shepherds the entire time they were there. So David sent some men down and asked if Nabal would be willing to give them some food and some supplies, because they had been taking care of his men and keeping them safe. Nabal said, "Why should I give you my bread and my meat?" And so the men went back and told David what Nabal had said. So David and his men decided to go and fight Nabal, because if he was going to treat them that way, they were going to go fight him. So let's begin in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And we're going to find out that Abigail, his wife, is going to go and rescue, keep David from doing this. So one of the servants of Nabal told Abigail, "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us. The whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing of ours was missing. Night and day, they were like a wall around us. The whole time we were herding our sheep near them, protecting us. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." So this servant realizes if Abigail doesn't do something quick, David and his men are going to come and kill everybody for the way that Nabal treated them. So Abigail acted quickly, and she took 200 loaves of bread and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep and roasted grain and 100 cakes of raisins and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and she loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell Nabal where she was going. So as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men coming down toward her, and she met them. And David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing, and he has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave any man alive that belongs to Nabal." When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off of her donkey, and she fell face down to the ground at his feet. And she said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He acts just like his name, which means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not even see the man the Lord sent. So now, as surely as the Lord your God lives and as you live, please do not harm anyone. Let this gift which your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the men who follow you, and please forgive Nabal. Please forgive him." And so David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to me. You have kept me from killing innocent men." So then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." So when Abigail went home to Nabal, he was having a feast, a big banquet like that of a king. So she told him nothing at all until morning. And then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. And his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. And 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. And his servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife. So Abigail quickly got a donkey, attended by her 5 servants, and went with David's messengers and became David's wife. All right, so she still protected her husband, even though she knew how terrible he was. And then we find out that Saul once again discovers where David is. He knows where he's hiding. And so he's come upon him. And David knew that Saul was there. So when they learned that Saul was camped nearby, David and one of his men named Abishai decided to go and spy out Saul's camp. So when they got there, they saw the army and they were asleep. But they could see where Saul and the commander of his army, whose name was Abner, that they were lying inside the camp with the army camped all around them. So let's begin reading in 1 Samuel 26, verse 7. And so they saw Abner and Saul with the men all around him, and Abishai said to David, Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed king and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and die. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed king. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head, and let's go. And so they crept into the camp. So David, look how close they are to them. There's King Saul with his spear. So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they laughed. No one saw what they were doing, because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. And then David crossed over to the other side and stood on the top of the hill some distance away. There was a wide space between them, and he called out to Abner, Are you going to answer me, Abner? And Abner said, Who are you that calls to the king? He said, Why haven't you protected the king, Abner? Look at me. I now have the king's spear. I have the water jug that was by his head. Why weren't you protecting him? And then Saul recognized David's voice. And he said, Is that your voice, David? He said, Yes, it is. And why are you still chasing me? What have I done to you? Why do you hunt me down? And Saul said, I'm sorry, I've sinned. But because you saved my life today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely I've acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. So David sent his spear and his water jug back by a servant. And he said, I could have killed you today, but I didn't lay a hand on you. But may you please deliver me from evil. And Saul said, May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things, and you will win. So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. However, Saul did not keep his promise. He continued to chase after David. What in the world? How is all this going to end? I don't know. You're going to have to come back next week, and let's find out what happens. Hope you're all having a good week. I love you. Be the best that you can be this week. Until next week, I miss you. Bye-bye.